The Fargo courtroom fell silent as Judge Howard Reynolds handed down 3 consecutive life sentences to the teenage killer who had methodically planned what prosecutors called a family cleansing. Behind Ethan Wilson's boyish appearance lurked a calculating mind that had researched knife techniques and staged a fake home invasion to cover his brutal attack on the 2 people who should have been able to trust him most. What the jury never heard was the shocking contents of a second journal, discovered too late for trial, that suggested this 16-year-old had been contemplating murder since he was just 12 years old. In the quiet city of Fargo, North Dakota, 16-year-old Ethan Wilson brutally murdered his mother, Olivia Wilson, and his 13-year-old sister, Emma Wilson, in their suburban home on January 12, 2023. The victims were discovered in their beds, having suffered multiple stab wounds from a kitchen knife that was later recovered from the family's garden shed. Responding officers described it as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had encountered in their careers, with defensive wounds indicating both victims had been awake and fighting for their lives during portions of the attack. The Wilson home, a tidy 2-story house on Maple Avenue, became a macabre spectacle as crime scene tape fluttered in the bitter North Dakota wind, neighbors gathering in shocked clusters despite the below-freezing temperatures. Fargo, a city of approximately 125,000 residents nestled against the Minnesota border, was unaccustomed to such extreme violence, particularly within families. The community prided itself on its low crime rates, good schools, and the kind of neighborly trust that meant many residents still left their doors unlocked despite living in a sizable city. The stark, frozen prairie landscape surrounding Fargo seemed to mirror the emotional numbness that descended upon the community as news of the double homicide spread throughout local media channels. What made the crime particularly shocking was not just its brutality, but its perpetrator, a high school sophomore described by teachers as quiet but bright, a boy who had never been in serious trouble before. The murders occurred between 1 and 3 in the morning, according to the medical examiner's preliminary findings, while a blizzard raged outside, muffling any sounds that might have alerted neighbors earlier. Olivia Wilson, 42, was killed first in her bedroom, suffering 17 stab wounds primarily to her chest and neck, with defensive wounds on her hands, suggesting she had awakened during the attack and attempted to fight off her assailant. Emma Wilson was killed in her bedroom across the hall, receiving 23 stab wounds concentrated in her chest, neck, and face, with blood evidence indicating she had tried to flee into the hallway before being dragged back into her room. The overkill nature of the attack, with a total of 40 stab wounds between the 2 victims, immediately suggested to investigators a crime of passion or rage rather than a random act of violence. The first hint that this was no ordinary home invasion came when officers found Ethan Wilson in the basement with only minor cuts on his hands and a seemingly rehearsed story about intruders breaking in. His clothing had traces of blood despite his claim of hiding during the entire attack, and his emotional state struck the first responding officers as oddly detached. Detective Marcus Johnson, a 20-year veteran of the Fargo Police Department who specialized in homicide investigations, noted in his initial report that the teen's account contained several inconsistencies. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, nothing of value appeared to be missing from the home, and most tellingly, there were no footprints in the fresh snow surrounding the house other than those made by the first responders. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero that night, with heavy snowfall creating the perfect natural record of anyone approaching or leaving the Wilson residence. The calculated nature of the crime became apparent as investigators processed the scene throughout that first day. The murder weapon, a 8-inch chef's knife from the kitchen's knife block, had been cleaned and hidden in the garden shed beneath a stack of gardening supplies. Bloody clothes belonging to Ethan had been discovered stuffed behind boxes in his bedroom closet, apparently hastily hidden. Computer forensics would later reveal that someone had used the family computer to search for information on how to stage a crime scene and clean blood evidence just days before the murders. The Wilson home, once a place of warmth in the frigid North Dakota winter, had become a house of horrors in a single night, its walls now bearing silent witness to an unthinkable family tragedy. Neighbors described hearing nothing unusual that night, aside from the howling wind of the blizzard that had enveloped Fargo in a blanket of white. The Wilson house sat on a quarter-acre lot in a neighborhood where homes were spaced far enough apart that screams might not carry, particularly during a winter storm. The isolation created by the weather had provided the perfect cover for the brutal crime that unfolded inside. Mrs. Helen Bergstrom, who lived next door, told police she had noticed lights on in the Wilson home around 2 a.m. when she got up for a glass of water, but thought nothing of it at the time. It wasn't until she saw Ethan standing in the driveway in his pajamas at 7:30 the next morning, seemingly in a daze, that she became concerned and approached him. According to Mrs. Bergstrom's statement, Ethan claimed that someone had broken into their house and that he couldn't find his mother or sister. The neighbor immediately called 911, and Officer Peter Larson arrived at the scene within 4 minutes, making the grim discovery after entering the unlocked front door. Officer Larson described finding Ethan sitting on the living room couch, staring blankly at the wall, his pajama pants and T-shirt bearing small blood stains that the teen claimed came from checking on his family after the alleged intruders had left. The living room showed no signs of a struggle or theft, contradicting the boy's story about a robbery gone wrong. When asked why he hadn't called 911 himself, Ethan reportedly told Officer Larson that he had been too scared and couldn't find his phone, though investigators would later discover his cell phone charged and within easy reach on his bedside table. The peculiarities of the crime scene continued to mount as Detective Johnson arrived and began a more thorough assessment. No valuables were missing, not the 60-inch television in the living room, nor Olivia Wilson's jewelry box containing several expensive pieces that sat in plain view on her dresser. The back door was locked from the inside with a deadbolt, and all windows remained secure despite Ethan's claim that intruders had entered through the kitchen window. Most damning of all, footprint analysis in the fresh snow revealed only 3 sets of prints: Ethan's bare footprints leading briefly into the backyard and back, Officer Larson's boots from his approach to the house, and later Mrs. Bergstrom's tracks from when she had come over after seeing Ethan in the driveway. The pristine snow surrounding the house told a story that contradicted every element of Ethan's account, creating a white canvas that clearly showed no one had approached or fled the Wilson home during the night, except for Ethan himself. As the bitter North Dakota cold seeped into the crime scene, investigators worked methodically to document every detail before the bodies were removed. The thermostat in the Wilson home had been set unusually high at 78 degrees, causing investigators to speculate that Ethan might have been attempting to accelerate decomposition to confuse time of death determinations. Blood spatter analysis would later confirm that the attack on Olivia Wilson had begun while she was sleeping, with the first stab wounds delivered from someone standing beside her bed. The attack on Emma appeared to have started in a similar fashion, but had turned into a chaotic struggle that continued from her bedroom into the hallway and back again. Blood trails throughout the upstairs hallway told the story of a terrified 13-year-old girl trying desperately to escape her attacker, likely awakened by her mother's struggle just moments before. Olivia Wilson had been a beloved 5th-grade teacher at Roosevelt Elementary School for 15 years, known for her patient demeanor and innovative teaching methods that engaged even the most reluctant learners. Colleagues described her as the kind of educator who arrived early and stayed late, often using her own money to purchase supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them. Her classroom walls were always covered with student artwork and inspirational quotes, creating what the school principal called a haven of creativity and safety for the children in her care. The 42-year-old single mother had recently been nominated for North Dakota Teacher of the Year, with recommendation letters praising her ability to connect with students facing personal challenges. Emma Wilson, at just 13 years old, had already established herself as one of the most promising young musicians in the state, having played cello since the age of 6. Her instructors at the Fargo Youth Symphony Orchestra described her as possessing not only technical skill beyond her years, but also an emotional depth to her playing that was rare in someone so young. The 8th grader at Lincoln Middle School maintained straight A's while practicing cello for 3 hours daily and volunteering at the local animal shelter every weekend. Emma's music teacher, Rebecca Hansen, fought back tears during her interview with police, revealing that the girl had recently been accepted to attend a prestigious summer music program at the Interlochen Center for the Arts in Michigan, an opportunity that would have potentially set her on a path toward a professional music career. The Wilson family had not always been just the three of them. Olivia had divorced Samuel Wilson 3 years earlier after what friends described as a difficult marriage, marked by Samuel's struggle with alcoholism. Samuel had moved to Minneapolis following the divorce and, according to court records, had been inconsistent with both child support payments and visitation with his children. Olivia had worked tirelessly to maintain stability for her children, despite the financial strain of suddenly becoming a single-income household, taking on tutoring jobs during summer breaks and weekends. Friends marveled at how she managed to attend all of Emma's recitals and Ethan's occasional soccer games while maintaining her demanding teaching schedule and running the household single-handedly. In the weeks before her death, Olivia had confided in several close friends about growing concerns regarding Ethan's behavior, describing him as increasingly withdrawn and hostile, following a Christmas visit with his father that had apparently ended poorly. Shannon Murphy, Olivia's closest friend and fellow teacher, told investigators that Olivia had been researching therapists who specialized in adolescent behavior and had planned to make an appointment for Ethan the very week she was killed. Shannon described a phone conversation just 2 days before the murders, during which Olivia had sounded unusually worried, saying that she had found disturbing drawings in Ethan's room, but was hesitant to confront him directly for fear of pushing him further away. The devoted mother had been caught in the impossible situation that many parents of troubled teens face, trying to get help for a child who was increasingly resistant to parental intervention. Emma Wilson's friends painted a picture of a kind, creative girl who had been her mother's greatest supporter and confidant. According to her best friend, Jessica Taylor, Emma had recently begun to express fear of her older brother, claiming that she had twice awakened to find him standing in her doorway, watching her sleep. Jessica stated that Emma had planned to talk to her mother about installing a lock on her bedroom door, but had been hesitant to cause more stress for Olivia, who was already worried about Ethan's behavior. The relationship between the siblings had reportedly deteriorated significantly in the months before the murders, with Emma confiding in friends that Ethan had begun making comments about how their mother always took her side and cared more about her stupid cello than anything else. The Wilson home on Maple Avenue had once been a place of warmth and music, with neighbors recalling the sound of Emma's cello practice floating through open windows during summer evenings. Linda Peterson, who lived across the street, remembered Olivia planting tulips with her children each fall, preparing for the brief but beautiful North Dakota spring that seemed so far away during the harsh winters. The family had been active in the community, with Olivia serving on the PTA and organizing the annual neighborhood block party each July. Emma had performed Christmas carols on her cello at the local nursing home each December, bringing joy to elderly residents who looked forward to her visits. Even during the most difficult periods following the divorce, Olivia had maintained these family traditions, determined to provide her children with stability and a sense of community connection. In the stark landscape of winter in Fargo, where the endless prairie meets the edge of the city and temperatures regularly plunge below zero, the Wilson family had created a home that neighbors described as a lighthouse of warmth. Friends who had visited described Olivia's collection of handmade quilts draped over every couch and chair, the refrigerator covered with Emma's orchestra schedules and school awards, and the bookshelf filled with well-worn classics that Olivia loved to discuss with her students. The kitchen table was typically covered with school papers Olivia was grading alongside Emma's sheet music, the heart of a home where education and creativity were highly valued. What no one saw hidden beneath this veneer of normal family life were the growing tensions and the increasingly dark thoughts of the teenage boy who moved silently through these warm, loving spaces while harboring unimaginable rage. Olivia's colleagues at Roosevelt Elementary created a memorial in the school library, featuring her favorite books and photographs of her with her students over the years. Principal David Anderson described the profound loss felt by the entire school community, explaining how Olivia had mentored new teachers and championed programs for at-risk students throughout her 15-year career. Many parents brought their children to leave flowers and handwritten notes, expressing how Mrs. Wilson had made lasting impressions on their lives through her dedicated teaching and genuine care. One particularly poignant note from a former student read, "Mrs. Wilson believed in me when no one else did, and that changed everything." At Lincoln Middle School, Emma's empty chair in the orchestra remained untouched, with her sheet music still on the stand and a single white rose placed where she would have sat. Her cello teacher, Mr. Gregory Wilson, no relation, established a memorial scholarship in her name for promising young musicians who could not afford instruments or lessons. In a community gathering held in the school auditorium, recordings of Emma's recent performances were played as photographs of her life were projected on a screen, her clear talent evident even to those who had never met her. Friends shared stories of her kindness, how she had tutored struggling classmates in math, knitted scarves for homeless veterans each winter, and once given up her solo in a concert so that a nervous newcomer would have more time to prepare. Each recollection painted a clearer picture of the extraordinary young woman whose life had been so violently cut short. The dual loss of a dedicated teacher and a promising young musician reverberated throughout Fargo, a city small enough that the connections between residents created a web of shared grief. Students who had been in Olivia's class years earlier returned to place flowers at the growing memorial outside the Wilson home, standing silently in the bitter cold as they remembered the teacher who had made such an impact on their lives. Members of the Fargo Youth Symphony played at a candlelight vigil held in the town square, their music rising into the clear, cold night air as hundreds of community members stood with candles flickering against the darkness. In a city accustomed to enduring harsh physical conditions, this emotional storm struck at the heart of the community's sense of safety and trust, leaving residents to question how such violence could erupt within a family that had seemed, from the outside, to embody the values the community held dear. The 911 call came in at 7:32 on the morning of January 13th, with Helen Bergstrom's voice betraying rising panic as she reported finding her teenage neighbor outside in pajamas, claiming his family had been attacked. The dispatcher kept Mrs. Bergstrom on the line while officers were dispatched to the scene, the recording capturing the moment when the neighbor's concern turned to horror after Ethan Wilson told her he had checked on them and there was blood everywhere. Officer Peter Larson's body camera footage from his arrival 4 minutes later would become crucial evidence, documenting his approach to the house and his initial contact with Ethan, who was sitting on the front steps despite the temperature being minus 11 degrees. The teenager's oddly flat affect and the inconsistencies in his story raised immediate red flags for the experienced officer who radioed for backup before entering the residence. The body camera footage continued as Officer Larson entered the Wilson home, first clearing the main floor before discovering the gruesome scene upstairs. The video, later described by the prosecutor as chilling in its documentation of both the crime scene and the suspect's behavior, showed Ethan remaining downstairs while Larson discovered the bodies, the teen staring blankly at the wall rather than displaying the distress expected from someone whose family had just been attacked. When Officer Larson returned downstairs, visibly shaken by what he had found, his questions about what had happened were met with Ethan's rehearsed-sounding story about being awakened by noises in the night, hiding in the basement until morning, and then discovering his mother and sister had been attacked. The officer's training in recognizing deception was evident as he carefully maintained a neutral tone while noting every inconsistency in the teenager's account. Detective Marcus Johnson arrived at 8:15, bringing with him 20 years of homicide investigation experience and a methodical approach that had earned him the nickname the Clockmaker among his colleagues for his precision in piecing together crime scenes. His first action was to secure the perimeter of the property, noting with interest the undisturbed snow surrounding the house, except for the paths created by Officer Larson and Mrs. Bergstrom. The detective's initial walkthrough of the crime scene was captured by the body camera he routinely wore, his quiet observations about blood spatter patterns, the position of the victims, and the lack of signs of forced entry laying the groundwork for the case that would later be presented in court. Johnson immediately noticed what appeared to be a staged scene of ransacking in Olivia Wilson's bedroom, with drawers pulled out but their contents neatly disturbed rather than showing the chaotic searching typical of a real burglary. The first 48 hours of the investigation unfolded with the precision of a well-oiled machine, as the Fargo Police Department, despite having limited experience with homicides of this magnitude, followed established protocols with careful attention to detail. Crime scene technicians documented and collected over 200 pieces of evidence from the Wilson home, including blood samples from various locations, fingerprints, the bedding from both victims' rooms, and Ethan's clothing and shoes. The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Phillips, arrived at 9:45 to conduct her preliminary examination of the bodies before they were transported to the morgue for full autopsies. Her initial assessment confirmed what the blood evidence already suggested, that Olivia Wilson had been attacked first while sleeping, and Emma had likely been killed after being awakened by the sounds of her mother's struggle. Detective Johnson made the critical decision to separate Ethan from the crime scene, having him transported to the police station under the guise of taking his formal statement in a more comfortable environment. This standard procedure allowed investigators to continue processing the scene without the suspect present, while also placing Ethan in an environment where his reactions could be more closely observed. Because he was a minor, the police contacted his father, Samuel Wilson, who was in Minneapolis, informing him of the situation and requesting that he come to Fargo immediately. In the interim, Ethan's high school principal, Dr. Barbara Mills, agreed to serve as an appropriate adult present during questioning, a role she would later describe as the most disturbing experience of my 30-year career in education, after witnessing the teenager's disconnected recounting of discovering his murdered family. The medical examiner's preliminary findings, delivered by phone to Detective Johnson at 11:20 that morning, provided the first scientific timeline of the murders. Based on body temperature, lividity, and rigor mortis, Dr. Phillips estimated that both victims had been killed between 1 and 3 in the morning, approximately 4 to 6 hours before the 911 call. This timeline directly contradicted Ethan's claim that he had been awakened by noises in the middle of the night and had hidden until morning. As the medical evidence suggested, he would have been hiding for only a few hours at most. Blood evidence found on Ethan's pajamas, which he claimed came from checking on his family after the attack, was inconsistent with passive transfer that would occur from merely touching the victims. The small spatter patterns suggested he had been present during active bleeding, a detail that would become crucial as the case built against him. By mid-afternoon on that first day, the forensic team had made several significant discoveries that shifted the investigation firmly toward Ethan as the prime suspect. A search of the garden shed revealed the murder weapon, an 8-inch chef's knife from the kitchen, partially cleaned but still bearing traces of blood in the handle crevices. Hidden behind boxes in Ethan's bedroom closet, technicians discovered a plastic bag containing a blood-soaked T-shirt and sweatpants that appeared to match what neighbors had seen him wearing the previous day. Most damning of all was the discovery of a journal hidden beneath Ethan's mattress, containing disturbing entries about his resentment toward his mother and sister, including one dated just 3 days before the murders that read, "They don't deserve the life they have while Dad suffers alone. Someone needs to balance the scales." As darkness fell on that first day of investigation, bringing with it plunging temperatures typical of North Dakota in January, Detective Johnson coordinated with the digital forensics team to examine the family's electronic devices. The Wilson home had 3 computers: Olivia's laptop, a desktop computer in the living room, and Ethan's gaming laptop. While the desktop and Olivia's computer showed no suspicious activity, Ethan's laptop revealed an internet history that had been partially deleted but was recoverable by the technicians. The searches, made in the week before the murders, included phrases such as "how to make murder look like robbery," "knife-killing techniques," "how long does it take someone to die from stab wounds," and "how to clean blood evidence." These digital breadcrumbs, combined with the physical evidence already collected, painted a disturbing picture of premeditation that contradicted every element of Ethan's story about intruders. By the morning of January 14th, the focus of the investigation had shifted entirely to Ethan Wilson, though Detective Johnson maintained the appearance of pursuing multiple angles to avoid alerting the teenager that he was now the prime suspect. Samuel Wilson had arrived from Minneapolis late the previous night, and after being briefed on the evidence discovered so far, had agreed to allow the continued questioning of his son. The father's shock was evident in the interview room footage, his face ashen as he sat beside Ethan during the morning's questioning session. Detective Johnson employed the strategic approach of starting with open-ended questions about the family dynamics, watching carefully as Ethan described a normal relationship with his mother and sister that contradicted the resentment-filled journal entries investigators had discovered. The breakthrough came when Detective Johnson received a call from Lincoln Middle School, where Emma Wilson had been a student. Her guidance counselor, Martha Reynolds, had come across a concerning email Emma had sent her just 1 week before her death, in which she expressed fear about her brother's increasingly erratic behavior. The email detailed incidents including Ethan standing in her doorway watching her sleep, making threatening comments about her stealing Mom's attention, and an incident where he had killed her pet hamster and claimed it was an accident. Ms. Reynolds had scheduled a meeting with Emma for what would have been the day after her murder, planning to discuss these concerns and potentially report them to Child Protective Services. This independent verification of Emma's fear of her brother, coming from a source Ethan couldn't have known about, provided investigators with crucial context for understanding the family dynamics leading up to the murders. Simultaneously, forensic analysis of the blood evidence was yielding results that systematically dismantled Ethan's version of events. Blood spatter expert Dr. Michelle Chang determined that the Cast-off patterns on the ceiling of Olivia's bedroom were consistent with a right-handed attacker of approximately Ethan's height, standing beside the bed and delivering multiple downward stab wounds. Traces of blood found on the bathroom sink drain trap indicated that someone had attempted to wash blood off themselves shortly after the murders, contradicting Ethan's claim that he had remained hidden in the basement until morning. Most significantly, several drops of Emma's blood were discovered on the inside of the basement door, indicating that the killer had entered the basement after attacking Emma, not that Ethan had been hiding there during the attacks as he claimed. The digital forensics team made another critical discovery while analyzing Ethan's phone, which he had claimed he couldn't find to call for help after discovering his family. The device's location data showed movement throughout the house during the estimated time of the murders, including in both victims' bedrooms, directly contradicting his story of hiding in the basement. Text messages recovered from the phone revealed a conversation with a friend from school just hours before the murders, in which Ethan had ominously written, "After tonight, everything changes. I'm finally going to fix what's been broken for too long." When shown these messages during questioning, Ethan claimed he had been referring to a plan to confront his mother about contacting his father more regularly, but the timing and phrasing took on a much darker significance in light of what had occurred. By the afternoon of the second day, investigators had interviewed 15 of Ethan's classmates and teachers, building a troubling profile of a teenager who had undergone a significant personality change in the months before the murders. His former soccer coach described him as having become increasingly isolated and angry after quitting the team in October, while his English teacher reported a disturbing essay Ethan had written about justifiable homicide that had prompted her to speak with the school counselor. Several classmates described incidents of Ethan expressing unusual interest in violent crime scenes and making comments about his mother ruining his father's life through the divorce. His closest friend, Tyler Andrews, reluctantly admitted that Ethan had often complained about his sister being the favorite child and had once said that everyone would be better off if Emma wasn't around to take up all the oxygen in the house. The school counselor, Dr. Robert Chen, provided perhaps the most illuminating perspective on Ethan's state of mind in the months leading up to the murders. Dr. Chen had met with Ethan 6 times in the previous semester after teachers reported concerning behavior, including sudden outbursts of anger and a sharp decline in academic performance. In their sessions, Ethan had expressed intense resentment toward his mother for the divorce, blaming her entirely despite court records indicating that Samuel Wilson's alcoholism and verbal abuse had been the primary factors in the marriage's dissolution. Dr. Chen noted that Ethan had begun idealizing his absent father and demonizing his mother, creating a narrative in which he and his father were victims of Olivia's supposed manipulation and favoritism toward Emma. The counselor had been sufficiently concerned about Ethan's distorted thinking that he had called Olivia Wilson just 2 weeks before her death to recommend family therapy, a suggestion she had readily agreed to. The physical evidence continued to mount as the crime scene team completed their meticulous processing of the Wilson home. In addition to the bloody clothing and murder weapon already discovered, technicians found a hidden collection of printed articles about famous family murders in a box under Ethan's bed, some with passages highlighted and annotated in his handwriting. A draft of a letter to his father was discovered in Ethan's desk drawer, dated January 11th, just 1 day before the murders, in which he wrote, "I'm going to make things right, Dad. After tomorrow, you won't have to deal with them anymore, and we can be together again like we should be." The letter had never been sent, but its existence further undermined any remaining doubt about Ethan's role in the killings and suggested a disturbing belief that murdering his mother and sister would somehow reunite him with his father. By the evening of January 14th, Detective Johnson had assembled enough evidence to approach the district attorney about charging Ethan Wilson with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The decision to charge him as an adult, despite his age of 16, came after reviewing the extensive evidence of premeditation and the particularly brutal nature of the crimes. In North Dakota, minors as young as 14 can be tried as adults for serious offenses, and the district attorney felt the circumstances clearly warranted such an approach. The final piece fell into place when the blood analysis confirmed that DNA from both victims was present on the knife found in the garden shed, and that Ethan's fingerprints were the only ones on the handle. With this scientific confirmation linking the suspect directly to the murder weapon, investigators prepared to confront Ethan with the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. During this critical phase of the investigation, Samuel Wilson's role shifted from that of a grieving father to a potential witness with valuable insights into his son's state of mind. In a lengthy interview with Detective Johnson, Samuel acknowledged his own failings as a father, including his struggles with alcoholism and his inconsistent presence in his children's lives after the divorce. He described a Christmas visit just 3 weeks before the murders, during which Ethan had become increasingly agitated, making accusations that Olivia was purposely keeping him from his father, and that Emma was complicit in this perceived manipulation. Samuel admitted that rather than correcting these misperceptions, he had sometimes encouraged them, making comments about Olivia being controlling and playing favorites with Emma. This tacit validation of Ethan's distorted worldview, coming from the father he idolized, may have been the final factor that pushed an already troubled teenager toward violence as a solution to his perceived problems. On the morning of January 15th, the 3rd day of the investigation, Detective Marcus Johnson assembled his team to systematically organize the mountain of evidence they had collected. The conference room at the Fargo Police Department headquarters was transformed into a command center, with crime scene photographs, timeline charts, and evidence logs covering every wall. Johnson, known for his methodical approach, assigned specialized tasks to each team member to ensure no potential evidence was overlooked as they built what was rapidly becoming an airtight case against Ethan Wilson. The detective's 20 years of experience had taught him that even the strongest cases could fall apart without proper documentation and chain of custody, and he was determined that the brutal murders of Olivia and Emma Wilson would result in justice. The forensic evidence formed the backbone of the case, with Dr. Michelle Chang's blood spatter analysis providing crucial insights into how the attacks had unfolded. Her detailed report, delivered that morning, included scale diagrams showing that the perpetrator had first attacked Olivia Wilson while standing on the right side of her bed, delivering multiple downward stab wounds that created distinctive cast-off patterns on the headboard and adjacent wall. The blood evidence in Emma's room told the story of a victim who had awakened and attempted to flee, with blood trails showing she had made it to her doorway before being dragged back inside. Most damning was Dr. Chang's analysis of microscopic blood spatter found on Ethan's glasses, retrieved from his bedside table, which contained a fine mist of blood that could only have been deposited during active stabbing, directly contradicting his claim of finding the bodies hours after the attacks. The digital evidence team had completed their analysis of all electronic devices in the Wilson home, creating a comprehensive timeline of activity that further incriminated Ethan. In the week before the murders, his laptop showed searches not only for murder techniques, but also for information about juvenile sentencing in North Dakota and whether minors could inherit if they killed their parents. His phone's location data placed him moving throughout the house during the estimated time of the killings, including multiple trips between the victims' bedrooms, the bathroom, and eventually the garden shed where the murder weapon was hidden. The data also showed that after the murders, Ethan had spent nearly 40 minutes browsing Instagram and playing an online game, behavior profoundly inconsistent with someone who had just discovered his family brutally murdered or who was hiding in fear from supposed intruders. The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Phillips, provided her final autopsy reports, which detailed the extensive injuries suffered by both victims and offered insights into the attacker's state of mind. Olivia Wilson had sustained 17 stab wounds, primarily to her chest and neck, with the pattern and depth indicating extreme force and determination, according to Dr. Phillips. Emma's 23 wounds showed an even greater level of violence, with several post-mortem injuries suggesting continued attacking even after she had died. The defensive wounds on both victims' hands and arms indicated they had been conscious for at least part of the attacks, trying desperately to protect themselves from their assailant. Toxicology reports showed neither victim had any drugs or alcohol in their system, and both had been in excellent health prior to the attacks, 2 lives in their prime cut, brutally short. The psychological profile of Ethan Wilson became an increasingly important component of the case as investigators sought to understand the motivation behind such an extreme act of family violence. Dr. Patricia Mendoza, a forensic psychologist with the North Dakota State Forensic Unit, was brought in to review the evidence, including Ethan's journal entries, school records, and interviews with those who knew him. Her preliminary assessment, delivered on day 3 of the investigation, described a teenager exhibiting several concerning traits. A distorted sense of reality, in which he viewed himself as a victim despite his privileged position in the family, an unusual preoccupation with revenge scenarios, and an ability to compartmentalize emotions that allowed him to plan and execute violence against those closest to him. While Dr. Mendoza cautioned against making a formal diagnosis without direct evaluation, she noted that the evidence suggested traits consistent with developing antisocial personality disorder, exacerbated by the family disruption of divorce and his father's inconsistent presence. Interviews with the Wilson family's broader social circle continued to yield insights into the dynamics that had preceded the murders. Olivia's sister, Catherine Hayes, who lived in Minneapolis near Samuel Wilson, described increasingly concerning phone calls from Olivia in the months before her death. Catherine recounted how her sister had expressed worry about Ethan's obsession with his father and his growing hostility toward Emma, whom he had begun to blame for the family's problems. Several of Olivia's colleagues confirmed that she had been researching therapists specializing in adolescent behavior and had expressed fear about Ethan's declining mental state. Emma's cello teacher revealed that the young girl had begun leaving her instrument at school rather than bringing it home, explaining to him that Ethan hates the sound and gets really angry when I practice, suggesting that the tensions in the home had been escalating in ways that those outside the immediate family were only beginning to understand. Perhaps the most revealing evidence came from Ethan's own words, captured in the journal discovered beneath his mattress and in text messages exchanged with friends in the months leading up to the murders. The journal contained not just expressions of anger, but detailed fantasies of violence, including sketches of knife wounds and entries calculating how removing his mother and sister from his life would solve his problems. One entry, dated December 28th, read, "Mom and Emma are the only thing standing between me and Dad being a family again. If they were gone, he'd have to take me in, and we could start over without their constant manipulation and lies." Text exchanges with his friend Tyler showed Ethan's growing preoccupation with true crime stories, particularly cases where children had killed their parents, with messages asking disturbing questions like, "Do you think people really understand when someone has no choice but to take extreme measures?" As Detective Johnson compiled the evidence for the district attorney's office, the timeline of the murders came into sharp focus. On January 12th, The day of the murders, Olivia Wilson had taught her fifth-grade class as usual, then attended a parent-teacher conference until 5:30 in the evening. Emma had orchestra practice after school and was dropped off at home by her friend Jessica's mother at approximately 6:45. Ethan had claimed to be homesick from school that day, though his online activity showed he had been researching cleaning products that remove blood and methods for staging crime scenes to look like burglaries. Neighbors reported seeing all lights in the Wilson home go out by 10:30, which aligned with Olivia's typical routine of ensuring everyone was in bed at a reasonable hour on school nights. What happened in the dark hours that followed would be reconstructed through the physical evidence, with each drop of blood and digital timestamp adding to the horrific picture of a teenager methodically murdering his sleeping mother and then his sister when she awoke during the attack. The garden shed where the murder weapon was found yielded additional evidence when crime scene technicians conducted a more thorough examination on the third day. Hidden under a loose floorboard, they discovered a plastic bag containing a pair of rubber gloves with traces of bleach and blood, along with a handwritten list titled Steps that outlined a chilling plan. 1. Mom first, silent. 2. M next, quick. 3. Clean knife, hide clothes. 4. Wait 4 hours. 5. Call 911, report break-in. The discovery of this written plan was perhaps the most damning evidence of premeditation, showing not just that Ethan had committed the murders, but that he had carefully planned each step, including the false report of a break-in that he would make to police. The rubber gloves explained the lack of fingerprints in certain areas of the crime scene, suggesting an awareness of forensic techniques that was sophisticated for his age and indicative of the extensive research he had conducted before carrying out his plan. By the end of the third day of investigation, Detective Johnson and District Attorney Abigail Thomas met to review the case in its entirety, with Thomas concluding that they had more than sufficient evidence to charge Ethan Wilson as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The mountain of physical evidence, digital forensics, timeline inconsistencies, and psychological insights had created a comprehensive picture of a deeply disturbed teenager who had methodically planned and executed the brutal murders of his mother and sister. What remained unclear, and what would become a central question at trial, was whether anyone could have prevented this tragedy by recognizing and addressing the warning signs that, in hindsight, seemed so obvious. As Detective Johnson prepared for the formal arrest and charging of Ethan Wilson, he couldn't help but reflect on the system failures that had allowed a 16-year-old's resentment to fester into deadly violence that had forever altered the fabric of the Fargo community. On January 16th, 4 days after the murders, Detective Marcus Johnson formally arrested Ethan Wilson for the murders of his mother and sister, reading him his Miranda rights in the presence of his father and the public defender who had been appointed to represent him. The arrest took place in an interview room at the Fargo Police Department, where Ethan had been coming daily for continued interviews, under the pretense that he was still helping with the investigation. The teenager's face remained impassive as the handcuffs were placed around his wrists. His only visible reaction, a quick glance toward his father, who sat with his head in his hands, unable to look at his son. The culmination of 4 days of intensive investigation, the arrest was deliberately low-key, with Detective Johnson ensuring that media was not present in order to prevent any grandstanding that might later affect jury selection. The interrogation that followed the arrest represented Detective Johnson's final opportunity to obtain a confession before the case moved into the court system, where Ethan would likely be advised by his attorney to remain silent. Johnson employed a strategy that had served him well in previous homicide cases, a methodical presentation of evidence piece by piece designed to break down the suspect's denial by demonstrating the futility of continued lies. For the first hour, Ethan maintained his story about intruders breaking in while he hid in the basement, his voice flat, and his responses seemingly rehearsed as he repeated the same details he had given in previous interviews. The detective noted that the teenager made no inquiries about funeral arrangements for his mother and sister, showed no emotional reaction when discussing their deaths, and seemed more concerned with when he would be allowed to retrieve his gaming console from the house than with the investigation into his family's murders. The turning point came when Detective Johnson placed photographs of the bloody clothing found in Ethan's closet on the table between them, alongside images of the murder weapon recovered from the garden shed with Ethan's fingerprints highlighted. The teenager's carefully constructed facade began to show its first cracks as he shifted in his seat, his eyes darting between the photos and the door as if calculating his chances of maintaining the lie in the face of such evidence. When Johnson then produced printouts of Ethan's internet search history in the days before the murders, including queries about knife-killing techniques and staging crime scenes, the boy's breathing visibly changed, becoming rapid and shallow. Still, he clung to his denial, now claiming that someone must have used his computer and planted the evidence to frame him, though he could offer no explanation for who might have done this or why. Samuel Wilson, who had insisted on being present for the interrogation despite the emotional toll it was clearly taking on him, finally spoke up after 2 hours of watching his son continue to lie in the face of overwhelming evidence. In a voice thick with grief and anger, he addressed Ethan directly. "Stop lying, son. These people know what you did. I know what you did. Your mother and sister are gone forever, and all you can do is sit there and lie about it." The raw emotion in his father's voice seemed to reach Ethan in a way that the detective's methodical presentation of evidence had not, causing the teenager to freeze momentarily before dropping his head to stare at the table, his shoulders beginning to shake in what appeared to be the first genuine emotional response he had shown since the murders. What followed was a 20-minute silence during which Detective Johnson simply waited, allowing the weight of his father's words and the mountain of evidence to work on Ethan's resolve. The interrogation room camera captured this tense period of silence, broken only by the occasional sob from Samuel Wilson and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. When Ethan finally looked up, his expression had changed from defiance to resignation, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I just wanted to fix our family." This ambiguous statement, while not a direct confession, represented the first crack in his denial, and Johnson skillfully built upon it, asking open-ended questions about what Ethan had meant to fix and how he had planned to accomplish this. Over the next hour, Ethan's carefully constructed narrative unraveled completely as he moved from vague admissions to a full confession, describing in disturbing detail how he had waited until everyone was asleep before taking the kitchen knife to his mother's bedroom. He recounted how he had stood beside her bed for several minutes, watching her sleep and thinking about all the ways she had ruined our family before delivering the first stab wound to her chest. According to his confession, Olivia had awakened after the first blow, her eyes widening in shock at the sight of her son standing over her with a knife, managing to cry out his name before he stabbed her again in the throat to silence her. The teenager described the killing with a clinical detachment that Detective Johnson would later testify was one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, as if Ethan were describing a science experiment rather than the murder of his own mother. The killing of Emma, by Ethan's own account, had not been part of his original plan but became necessary when she was awakened by her mother's cry and came into the hallway to investigate. He described how she had seen him emerging from their mother's room, covered in blood, and had turned to run back to her room, likely to call for help. Ethan admitted to chasing his sister, catching her at her bedroom door, and dragging her back inside as she screamed and fought against him. The struggle with Emma had been more prolonged and chaotic than the attack on Olivia, with the 13-year-old desperately fighting for her life as her brother stabbed her repeatedly. In perhaps the most chilling moment of the confession, Ethan described how Emma had begged him to stop, crying out, "Please, Ethan, I love you, please don't do this," before he delivered the final fatal wounds to her neck. After completing his confession, Ethan described the calculated steps he had taken to cover up the crimes, including cleaning the knife, hiding his bloody clothes, and waiting several hours before approaching the neighbor to report a break-in. He admitted to creating the stage scene of ransacked drawers and intentionally leaving valuables untouched to support his story about interrupted burglars. When Detective Johnson asked about his motivation, Ethan's response revealed the distorted thinking that had led to the murders. "I thought if Mom and Emma were gone, Dad would have to take me back. We could be a real family again, just him and me. He always liked me best anyway, before Mom poisoned everything." This statement, recorded in the official confession, provided a window into the teenager's profoundly disturbed logic and his inability to process the consequences of his actions. The formal confession, lasting just over 3 hours, was videotaped in its entirety and would later become key evidence at trial, with portions played for the jury despite defense objections about the emotional impact of seeing the defendant describe the murders in his own words. Throughout the confession, Ethan's affect remained largely flat, with occasional moments of annoyance when asked to clarify details, but no expressions of remorse or recognition of the gravity of what he had done. When asked directly if he felt sorry for killing his mother and sister, he paused before responding, "I'm sorry it had to happen this way, but they didn't leave me any choice." This lack of empathy or genuine remorse would become a central theme in the prosecution's case, with experts later testifying about the concerning personality traits it revealed. At the conclusion of the interrogation, Ethan was formally processed into the Juvenile Detention Center, where he would remain until his arraignment and bail hearing. Detective Johnson ensured that he was placed on suicide watch, not because the teenager had expressed any suicidal ideation, but as a standard precaution in cases involving juvenile offenders charged with serious crimes. In his final interaction with Ethan before he was led away, Johnson asked if there was anything else he wanted to say for the record. The teenager considered the question for a moment before asking, "Will I still get my inheritance since they're dead?" The detective, despite his years of experience with homicide cases, was momentarily stunned by the callousness of the question, which revealed a profound disconnect from the human impact of his actions and a focus solely on how their deaths might benefit him, a moment that would be recounted during the trial as evidence of Ethan's disturbing lack of empathy. Samuel Wilson, who had remained in the interrogation room throughout his son's confession, was provided with victim services support as he processed the horrific details he had just heard. The father's devastation was complete. In a single act of violence, he had lost his former wife, his daughter, and now, in a different sense, his son as well. As he prepared to leave the police station, he asked Detective Johnson a question that had no easy answer. How did I not see this coming? It was a question that would haunt not only Samuel, but the entire Fargo community as they grappled with the reality that a seemingly normal teenager had harbored such deadly resentment toward his family that it had culminated in brutal violence. The red flags had been there, in Ethan's journal entries, in his internet searches, in his changing behavior noted by teachers and friends, but they had not been recognized in time to prevent tragedy, a failing of the systems designed to protect vulnerable family members from harm. On a cold April morning 9 weeks after the murders, the Cass County Courthouse in Fargo became the center of national attention as Ethan Wilson's trial began. Media trucks lined the streets surrounding the century-old brick building, their satellite dishes reaching toward the pale North Dakota sky like mechanical flowers seeking light. Inside, the historic courtroom with its dark wood paneling and high ceilings had been prepared for what the local newspaper called the most shocking murder. trial in Fargo's recent history, with additional seating installed to accommodate the overflow of press and community members seeking to witness the proceedings. Security was unusually tight, with additional officers posted at all entrances and attendees required to pass through metal detectors, a response to both the high-profile nature of the case and several threatening letters received by the courthouse after Ethan's arrest became public knowledge. District Attorney Abigail Thomas, a veteran prosecutor with 15 years of experience and a reputation for methodical preparation, arrived early with her team of 3 assistant district attorneys, their rolling briefcases filled with the thousands of pages of evidence they had assembled. Thomas, known for her straightforward style and unflappable demeanor in the courtroom, had personally handled 27 murder trials during her career, with 25 resulting in convictions. In her opening remarks to the press gathered outside the courthouse, she emphasized that while the defendant's youth was a factor the jury would need to consider, the premeditated nature of the crimes and their extreme brutality warranted the most serious charges possible under North Dakota law. Her decision to try Ethan Wilson as an adult, despite his age of 16, had been controversial, but was supported by state law, which allows juveniles as young as 14 to be tried as adults for serious offenses. The defense team, led by Public Defender Michael Novak, faced the daunting task of representing a client against whom the evidence was overwhelming and whose crimes had shocked the community that would provide the jury. Novak, with his salt and pepper beard and rumpled suits, had spent 20 years in the public defender's office and was known for his commitment to ensuring fair trials, even for those accused of the most heinous crimes. His strategy, glimpsed in pre-trial motions and jury selection questions, would focus not on denying Ethan's actions, but on questioning his mental state at the time of the murders, suggesting that a combination of adolescent brain development, untreated mental illness, and manipulation by his father had created a perfect storm that led to violence. The defense team included a forensic psychiatrist who would testify about Ethan's psychological evaluation, and a social worker who had investigated the family dynamics preceding the murders. Judge Howard Reynolds, a 63-year-old jurist with a reputation for running a tight courtroom and delivering sentences on the harsher end of the statutory guidelines, presided over the case. With 30 years on the bench, Judge Reynolds had handled numerous high-profile cases, including several involving juvenile defendants charged with serious crimes. His pre-trial rulings had generally favored the prosecution, including decisions to allow Ethan's confession video to be played in its entirety for the jury, and to permit testimony about his internet search history in the weeks before the murders. However, he had also granted some defense motions, including allowing expanded testimony about the Wilson family dynamics and Samuel Wilson's role in potentially influencing his son's distorted thinking about his mother and sister. The jury selection process had been particularly challenging, requiring a pool of over 100 potential jurors to find 12 people and 4 alternates who could approach the case with relative impartiality despite the extensive media coverage. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 26 to 71, with occupations including a nurse, 2 teachers, an accountant, a retired military officer, and several business professionals. During voir dire, potential jurors had been extensively questioned about their views on trying juveniles as adults, their personal experiences with family violence, and whether they could separate the emotional impact of the crimes from their assessment of the legal questions at hand. The selected jurors had all expressed confidence in their ability to render a fair verdict based solely on the evidence presented, though several acknowledged the emotional difficulty of serving on such a disturbing case. As the trial began, the courtroom fell silent when Ethan Wilson was led in by sheriff's deputies, the teenager now dressed in a navy blue suit that his father had purchased for the trial, rather than the orange jumpsuit he had worn during pre-trial hearings. At 5 feet 10 inches tall, with his light brown hair neatly combed and his glasses freshly cleaned, he looked more like a student arriving for a debate competition than a defendant facing 2 counts of first-degree murder. Several jurors visibly reacted to his youthful appearance, exchanging glances that suggested surprise at the disconnect between his ordinary teenage looks and the extraordinary violence he was accused of committing. Throughout the proceedings, Ethan maintained the same flat affect that Detective Johnson had noted during his interrogation, his face betraying little emotion, even when photographs of the crime scene were displayed on large screens for the jury's consideration. Judge Reynolds opened the proceedings with a stern admonition to everyone present about maintaining decorum despite the emotional nature of the case, warning that any outbursts would result in immediate removal from the courtroom. He then invited District Attorney Thomas to present her opening statement, a moment that had been anticipated since the case first made headlines 3 months earlier. Thomas approached the jury box with measured steps, making eye contact with each juror before beginning to speak in a clear, authoritative voice that carried to the farthest corner of the packed courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is about the darkest act imaginable. A son who methodically planned and executed the murders of his mother and sister as they slept in what should have been the safety of their own home." Thomas's 50-minute opening statement laid out the prosecution's case with devastating clarity, walking the jury through the timeline of the murders, the evidence recovered from the crime scene, and the defendant's calculated attempts to cover up his crimes by staging a burglary. She described Ethan Wilson not as a typical teenager, but as someone who had carefully researched how to kill, chosen his victims, selected his weapon, and executed his plan with a level of premeditation that is chilling in its thoroughness. Thomas showed the jury a timeline of Ethan's internet searches in the weeks before the murders, highlighting queries about knife wounds, cleaning blood evidence, and juvenile sentencing guidelines that demonstrated both intent and awareness of consequences. She concluded by directly addressing the question of the defendant's age, acknowledging his youth but arguing that age alone cannot explain or excuse the deliberate taking of 2 innocent lives after weeks of planning and research. When Michael Novak rose to present the defense's opening statement, he took a markedly different approach, speaking in a quiet, almost conversational tone that forced everyone in the courtroom to lean forward to hear him. "The facts of what happened that night are not in dispute," he began, a startling admission that caused murmurs to ripple through the gallery. "Ethan Wilson killed his mother and sister. That is a tragic truth that we do not contest." This strategic concession allowed Novak to shift the focus from whether Ethan had committed the acts to why he had done so, arguing that the teenager's actions were the result of a perfect storm of mental health issues, developmental immaturity, and family dysfunction that created a pressure cooker no 16-year-old could be expected to navigate successfully. Novak painted a picture of a family in crisis, with Ethan caught between warring parents after a bitter divorce, his father's alcoholism and subtle manipulation feeding the teenager's resentment toward his mother and sister. The defense attorney described how Samuel Wilson had repeatedly told his son that Olivia was responsible for breaking up their family, that she favored Emma, and that they would be a family again if only things were different. Phrases that Ethan, with his still developing adolescent brain, had interpreted in the most literal and devastating way possible. Novak introduced the concept of diminished capacity, explaining to the jury that while this was not a complete insanity defense, it recognized that Ethan's age, mental state, and the psychological manipulation he had experienced had severely impaired his ability to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder charges. As the opening statements concluded and Judge Reynolds called for the first witness, the battle lines of the trial were clearly drawn. The prosecution would present Ethan Wilson as a calculating killer who had planned and executed the murders with full awareness of his actions, while the defense would portray him as a mentally unstable teenager whose distorted thinking and family circumstances had created a tragedy that could have been prevented with proper intervention. The jurors, many taking detailed notes throughout both opening statements, now faced the difficult task of separating fact from emotion as they prepared to hear the evidence that would determine whether Ethan Wilson would spend the rest of his life in prison or receive the possibility of rehabilitation and eventual release that a lesser conviction might allow. The prosecution's first witness was Officer Peter Larson, who had been first to respond to the scene and whose body camera footage provided the jury with their first glimpse of both the crime scene and Ethan's behavior immediately after the murders were discovered. As the graphic footage played on screens throughout the courtroom, several jurors visibly struggled with the images of the blood-soaked bedrooms where Olivia and Emma Wilson had died. More telling, however, was the footage of Ethan sitting calmly on the living room couch as Officer Larson discovered the bodies upstairs, the teenager showing none of the distress or shock that would be expected from someone whose family had just been murdered. This stark contrast between the horror upstairs and Ethan's composed demeanor downstairs provided jurors with their first insight into the disconnect that would become central to the prosecution's portrayal of a teenager capable of compartmentalizing his emotions in a profoundly disturbing way. By the second week of the trial, the prosecution had established a comprehensive timeline of the murders through testimony from the medical examiner, crime scene technicians, and digital forensics experts who had analyzed Ethan Wilson's electronic devices. The courtroom had fallen into a somber rhythm, with journalists frantically taking notes as each new piece of evidence further illuminated the calculated nature of the crimes. Now, as District Attorney Abigail Thomas called her star witness, Detective Marcus Johnson, to the stand, the gallery grew especially quiet, knowing that his testimony would include the full confession that had until now been described but not played for the jury. Judge Reynolds reminded everyone present that despite the disturbing nature of what they were about to hear, any disruptions would result in immediate removal from the courtroom. Detective Johnson, with his precisely knotted tie and methodical speaking style, made an imposing figure on the witness stand as he was sworn in. Over his 20-year career, he had testified in dozens of murder trials, but he would later describe the Wilson case as the one that haunts me most, due to the youth of both the perpetrator and one of the victims. For nearly 4 hours, Johnson walked the jury through every aspect of the investigation, from his initial observations at the crime scene to the collection of key evidence, and finally to the interrogation that had resulted in Ethan's confession. His testimony was accompanied by crime scene photographs, evidence logs, and diagrams that painted a comprehensive picture of how the murders had unfolded and how the investigation had systematically dismantled Ethan's false story about intruders. The courtroom grew tense as District Attorney Thomas approached the moment everyone had been anticipating, the playing of Ethan's videotaped confession. "Detective Johnson," she asked, "did the defendant eventually confess to killing his mother and sister?" After Johnson's affirmative response, Thomas requested permission to play the recording, and despite a last-minute objection from defense attorney Novak about its prejudicial nature, Judge Reynolds allowed the video to be shown in its entirety. For the next 3 hours, the courtroom remained in stunned silence as Ethan's voice, calm and detached, described in clinical detail how he had stabbed his mother as she slept and then chased down his sister when she attempted to flee after discovering what he had done. The impact of the confession video on the jury was profound and immediately visible. 2 jurors openly wept as they listened to Ethan describe Emma's final pleas for her life, while others appeared physically ill during his descriptions of the repeated stabbing motions and the sounds his victims made as they died. Most disturbing to many observers was not just the content of Ethan's confession, but his effect while delivering it. The flat tone, the absence of emotional response when describing horrific acts, and his occasional impatience when asked to clarify details, as if the detective's questions were an inconvenience rather than an attempt to understand an unthinkable crime. When the recording finally ended with Ethan's question about whether he would still receive his inheritance, audible gasps could be heard throughout the courtroom, and Judge Reynolds called for a 30-minute recess to allow everyone to compose themselves before cross-examination began. Defense attorney Novak faced a nearly impossible task in cross-examining Detective Johnson after the devastating impact of the confession video. His strategy focused on questioning the interrogation techniques used to obtain the confession, suggesting that Johnson had manipulated a vulnerable teenager by having his father present and by presenting evidence in a way designed to break down Ethan's defenses. Novak particularly emphasized the 20 minutes of silence Johnson had maintained after Samuel Wilson's emotional outburst, arguing that this was a coercive tactic that exploited the father-son relationship to obtain a confession. Johnson, however, remained unshaken in his testimony, explaining that all procedures had been followed correctly, that Ethan had been properly Mirandized, and that the confession had been voluntary and uncoerced, points the prosecution reinforced by playing portions of the video showing Ethan being informed of his rights and explicitly waiving them. The prosecution's case reached its emotional peak with the testimony of Dr. Patricia Mendoza, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated Ethan Wilson after his arrest. Dr. Mendoza, with her precise language and professional demeanor, provided the jury with insights into the teenager's psychological state that helped explain how someone so young could commit such violent acts against his own family. Based on extensive interviews, psychological testing, and review of Ethan's writings and internet history, Dr. Mendoza testified that while the defendant did not meet the legal criteria for insanity, he displayed concerning traits consistent with a developing antisocial personality disorder, including a profound lack of empathy, a tendency toward manipulation, and an inability to form normal emotional attachments to others. Most damaging to the defense's case of diminished capacity was Dr. Mendoza's assessment that Ethan had been fully aware of the nature and wrongfulness of his actions at the time of the murders. Based on my evaluation, she testified, the defendant exhibited clear, goal-directed behavior before, during, and after the killings. His internet searches show he understood the legal consequences of his actions. His attempts to stage the scene as a burglary demonstrate awareness that what he was doing was wrong, and his ability to maintain a false narrative during initial questioning shows intact reality testing and awareness of social expectations. When asked directly whether Ethan's age mitigated his culpability, Dr. Mendoza acknowledged that adolescent brains are still developing impulse control and long-term thinking, but emphasized that the level of planning exhibited in this case goes well beyond impulsivity and suggests a calculated decision-making process that understood consequences but proceeded anyway. The most powerful visual evidence came when the prosecution introduced Ethan's journal, recovered from beneath his mattress during the investigation. As selected entries were displayed on screens throughout the courtroom, jurors were confronted with the teenager's disturbing thought processes in his own handwriting. One entry from 2 weeks before the murders read, "I had the dream again last night. Mom and Emma were gone, and Dad and I were back in our old house, just the two of us like it should be. I woke up feeling so peaceful. I think I know how to make the dream come true." Another entry, accompanied by detailed drawings of knife placement for maximum damage to vital organs, stated, "It needs to be quick and quiet. Mom first, then Emma. If I do it right, it will look like a break-in gone wrong, and no one will ever know. These journal entries directly contradicted the defense's argument that the murders had been the result of a momentary break with reality or overwhelming emotional distress. Instead, they painted a picture of a teenager who had contemplated and planned the killings over weeks or even months, who had researched methods and practiced scenarios, and who had maintained a detailed written record of his intentions. When prosecution attorney Thomas asked Dr. Mendoza about the significance of the journal, the psychologist explained that this level of detailed planning, combined with the emotional detachment evident in the clinical language used to describe violent acts against family members, suggests a profound disturbance in the defendant's ability to form normal emotional connections and recognize the humanity of his victims, even when those victims were his own mother and sister. The defense attempted to counter Dr. Mendoza's testimony with their own expert witness, Dr. Robert Fletcher, a child psychiatrist specializing in adolescent trauma and development. Dr. Fletcher emphasized the impact of Ethan's family situation on his psychological state, describing how the combination of his parents' divorce, his father's alcoholism and emotional manipulation, and the normal turbulence of adolescent development had created a perfect storm of psychological distress. He testified that teenagers in heightened emotional states often lack the neurological development to fully process consequences or control impulses, and that Ethan's actions, while horrific, needed to be understood in the context of a brain that was still developing the capacity for mature judgment and emotional regulation. However, Dr. Fletcher's testimony suffered a significant blow during cross-examination when District Attorney Thomas had him review excerpts from Ethan's internet search history, which showed queries such as, how long do juvenile killers serve before release? Can minors inherit if they kill their parents? And do juvenile records get sealed at 18? Thomas methodically led Dr. Fletcher through these searches, asking after each one whether they suggested impulse control problems or careful planning with awareness of consequences. By the end of the cross-examination, even the defense's own expert had been forced to concede that the evidence showed a concerning level of premeditation and awareness of legal consequences that undermined the argument that Ethan had acted solely from emotion or developmental limitations. The most damning testimony came from Emma's friend, Jessica Taylor, who described conversations in which Emma had expressed fear of her brother in the weeks before her death. Jessica recounted how Emma had told her about waking up to find Ethan standing in her doorway watching her sleep on multiple occasions, and how he had made comments about her stealing all of Mom's attention and always being the favorite. Fighting back tears, Jessica described a phone call just 3 days before the murders, during which Emma had said, "I'm actually scared of what Ethan might do sometimes. He looks at me like he hates me, and yesterday I found him going through my room when I came home from school." This testimony not only supported the prosecution's case about Ethan's deteriorating mental state, but also established that Emma had been aware of and frightened by her brother's behavior, making her final moments, as described in Ethan's confession, all the more tragic. As the prosecution approached the conclusion of its case, they called one final witness whose testimony would prove pivotal, Samuel Wilson, Ethan's father. Initially listed as a defense witness, Samuel had been subpoenaed by the prosecution. After pre-trial interviews suggested his testimony might actually strengthen their case rather than the defense's. Taking the stand wearing a dark suit and tie, his face drawn from months of grief and stress, Samuel Wilson presented a complex figure to the jury, both a victim who had lost his former wife and daughter, and potentially a contributing factor in his son's distorted thinking that had led to violence. The courtroom fell completely silent as he began to speak, everyone present aware that his testimony might be the most difficult yet most illuminating of the entire trial. After 12 days of testimony from 37 witnesses and the presentation of over 200 pieces of evidence, the fate of Ethan Wilson was placed in the hands of 12 jurors who filed solemnly into the deliberation room on a Wednesday morning in late April. Judge Howard Reynolds had spent nearly 2 hours instructing the jury on the applicable laws, explaining the elements required for first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter, as well as the special considerations they should take into account regarding the defendant's age at the time of the crimes. The jurors' faces reflected the gravity of their task as they carried with them thick notebooks filled with the notes they had taken throughout the trial, preparing to weigh evidence that none of them could have imagined encountering when they had reported for jury duty nearly 2 weeks earlier. The courtroom emptied into the hallways of the Cass County Courthouse as various parties settled in for what many legal observers expected would be at least a day or two of deliberations, given the complexity of the case and the emotional weight of deciding the fate of a 16-year-old defendant. District Attorney Abigail Thomas and her team established a temporary command post in a conference room down the hall, reviewing potential responses to various verdict scenarios while maintaining the composed professionalism that had characterized their handling of the case from the beginning. Defense attorney Michael Novak retreated to a small consultation room with his client, explaining what would happen next and preparing Ethan for the possibility of a guilty verdict, though maintaining that there was still hope the jury might be persuaded by their arguments for a lesser charge than first-degree murder. Ethan Wilson himself showed little reaction to the commencement of deliberations, his affect remaining as flat as it had been throughout the trial, even during the most damning testimony. The teenager had not taken the stand in his own defense, a strategic decision by his attorneys who feared that his lack of emotional response when discussing the murders would only further alienate the jury. Instead, he had sat at the defense table making occasional notes on a legal pad and whispering to his attorneys, his face rarely showing any emotion other than occasional annoyance when particular witnesses testified about his behavior before and after the killings. Now, as he waited for the jury's decision, he appeared more concerned with whether he would be allowed to have his books in the holding cell than with the gravity of what the verdict would mean for his future. In the courthouse plaza, a crowd of community members and media representatives gathered, their breath visible in the cool North Dakota spring air, as they discussed the case that had dominated local news for over 3 months. The murders of Olivia and Emma Wilson had shaken the Fargo community to its core, challenging residents' perceptions of their city as a safe place where such violence was something that happened elsewhere. Local churches had held prayer services for the victims. Their schools had established memorial scholarships in their names, and conversations throughout the city often returned to the question of how a teenager from an ordinary family could commit such an unthinkable act of violence. For many in Fargo, the trial had been not just about determining Ethan Wilson's guilt, but about trying to make sense of a crime that seemed to defy rational explanation. To the surprise of nearly everyone involved in the case, the jury buzzed for the bailiff after just 4 hours and 6 minutes of deliberation, indicating they had reached a verdict. Word spread rapidly through the courthouse and out to the plaza, where the gathered crowd began to move inside, filling the courtroom to capacity within minutes. Judge Reynolds, who had been working in his chambers on other cases, returned to the bench, his face betraying no reaction to the unexpected speed with which the jury had reached its decision. Court officers brought Ethan back from the holding cell, and attorneys for both sides returned to their tables, the defense team looking particularly concerned about what the quick deliberation might mean for their client. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces were solemn, and several appeared to have been crying, though all maintained the composure expected in such formal proceedings. The court clerk asked if they had reached a verdict, and the forewoman, a 56-year-old elementary school principal, replied that they had, handing the verdict forms to the bailiff, who delivered them to Judge Reynolds. The judge reviewed the forms silently, his expression unchanged, before returning them to the clerk to be read aloud. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone present held their breath, waiting for the words that would determine Ethan Wilson's fate. On the count of murder in the first degree of Olivia Wilson, we, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Wilson, guilty, the clerk read, her voice clear and steady in the silent courtroom. She continued, on the count of murder in the first degree of Emma Wilson, we, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Wilson, guilty. There was a moment of complete silence before the impact of the verdict registered, followed by muffled sobs from several people in the gallery, including teachers and friends of the victims who had attended throughout the trial. At the prosecution table, District Attorney Thomas closed her eyes briefly, a subtle acknowledgement of the justice she had sought for Olivia and Emma Wilson, while at the defense table, Michael Novak placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder in a gesture of support. Ethan Wilson himself showed the first significant emotional reaction he had displayed throughout the proceedings, his face crumpling as the verdict was read, his shoulders beginning to shake as the reality of spending potentially the rest of his life in prison began to sink in. For many observers, this belated display of emotion seemed to come not from remorse over his actions, but from the self-focused realization of the consequences he now faced. Judge Reynolds thanked the jury for their service and scheduled the sentencing hearing for 3 weeks later, remanding Ethan to custody until that time. As the deputies approached to lead him from the courtroom, Ethan looked back toward his father, who sat in the front row of the gallery, but Samuel Wilson could not meet his son's gaze, his own eyes fixed on the floor as he processed the culmination of a tragedy that had destroyed his family. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Thomas addressed the assembled media, her normally composed professional demeanor showing cracks of emotion as she discussed the verdict. Today, justice was served for Olivia and Emma Wilson, she stated, though no legal outcome can ever truly compensate for the loss of 2 beautiful lives cut tragically short. She acknowledged the unusual nature of trying such a young defendant as an adult, but maintained that the evidence had clearly shown the level of premeditation and awareness that justified the first-degree murder charges. When asked about the speed with which the jury had reached its verdict, Thomas suggested that the overwhelming evidence, particularly the defendant's own confession and journal entries, left little room for reasonable doubt about his actions or his intent. Defense attorney Novak also spoke briefly to the press, expressing respect for the jury's decision while indicating that they planned to appeal on several grounds, including the decision to try Ethan as an adult and the admission of certain evidence they had argued was prejudicial. This case has always been about a troubled 16-year-old whose mental health issues and family circumstances were not adequately addressed before tragedy struck, Novak stated, his voice reflecting the emotional toll of defending such a difficult case. While we accept the jury's verdict, we continue to believe that our justice system must find better ways to address the unique considerations of juvenile offenders, even in cases involving the most serious crimes. The reaction throughout Fargo was complex and multifaceted, with many expressing relief that justice had been served while simultaneously grappling with the tragedy of a situation where there could be no true winners, only varying degrees of loss. Roosevelt Elementary School, where Olivia Wilson had taught for 15 years, held a staff meeting after the verdict was announced, providing counselors for teachers who had worked closely with her and who had followed the trial with particular emotional investment. Lincoln Middle School, where Emma had been a student, similarly gathered students and staff to process the news, focusing not on the details of the crimes or the trial, but on remembering Emma's contributions to the school community and discussing how her memory could be honored moving forward. Samuel Wilson left the courthouse without speaking to the press, escorted by victim advocates who had supported him throughout the trial. Friends reported that he planned to leave Fargo immediately after the sentencing, unable to remain in the city where such tragedy had befallen his family. His position throughout the trial had been uniquely painful, mourning his former wife and daughter while simultaneously watching his son face justice for their murders, and hearing testimony that suggested his own behavior may have contributed to Ethan's distorted thinking about his mother and sister. In private conversations with the prosecutors, Samuel had expressed overwhelming guilt about the role he might have played in the tragedy, questioning whether things might have been different if he had been more present in his children's lives or more careful about how he spoke about their mother after the divorce. For the jurors, the experience of serving on such a high-profile and emotionally devastating case left lasting impacts that would continue long after the trial concluded. Several requested counseling services that were made available through the court system, recognizing the trauma of being immersed in the details of such brutal crimes for nearly 2 weeks. The forewoman later told reporters that while the decision to convict had been unanimous from the first vote, the jury had spent their deliberation time carefully reviewing the evidence and discussing the appropriate charges, particularly in light of the defendant's age. "We were all deeply aware of the gravity of sending a 16-year-old to prison potentially for life," she explained, "but the evidence of premeditation was simply overwhelming, and we felt we had no choice but to follow the law as the judge had instructed us." As night fell on Fargo on the day of the verdict, the lights of the city reflected off the remaining patches of spring snow, creating a landscape both beautiful and melancholy that seemed to mirror the community's state of mind. The justice system had functioned as designed, methodically examining evidence and reaching a verdict that most felt was appropriate given the facts of the case. Yet beneath the procedural resolution lay deeper questions that no trial could fully answer, about the failure to recognize warning signs, about the impact of family dysfunction on children's development, and about society's ability to identify and address mental health issues before they manifest in violence. For the residents of Fargo, the conclusion of Ethan Wilson's trial represented not an ending, but another step in the long process of healing from a tragedy that had revealed the fragility of the safety they had previously taken for granted in their Prairie City. 3 weeks after the guilty verdict, the Cass County Courthouse was once again filled to capacity as Judge Howard Reynolds prepared to sentence Ethan Wilson for the murders of his mother and sister. The sentencing hearing, scheduled for 9 a.m, had drawn an even larger crowd than the verdict announcement, with people lining up before dawn to secure seats in the courtroom. The atmosphere was somber as victims' advocates distributed small purple ribbons, Olivia's favorite color, to those who wished to show support for the victim's memory. In the front row of the gallery, teachers from Roosevelt Elementary sat together in a show of solidarity, many holding framed photographs of Olivia with her students, while Emma's orchestra friends clutched sheet music from her final recital, physical reminders of the talents and contributions that had been lost. Before pronouncing sentence, Judge Reynolds allowed impact statements from those affected by the murders, beginning with a powerful statement from Catherine Hayes, Olivia's sister and Emma's aunt. Standing at the podium with tears streaming down her face but her voice remarkably steady, Catherine addressed not just the court, but Ethan directly, turning to face her nephew as she spoke about the devastating hole left in their family by the loss of her sister and niece. Olivia was not just a wonderful teacher, but the heart of our family, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and organized our holiday gatherings, she said, her voice breaking slightly. And Emma, sweet, talented Emma, we will never hear her play her cello at Carnegie Hall as she dreamed of doing, never see her graduate or fall in love or have children of her own. The courtroom remained completely silent throughout her testimony, many wiping tears as Catherine concluded by saying, No sentence can bring them back or heal the wound in our hearts, but it can ensure that no other family experiences this kind of loss at Ethan's hands. Samuel Wilson had declined to make a formal victim impact statement, but his written statement was read by the victim advocate who had supported him throughout the trial. The words of a father caught in an unimaginable position, grieving his daughter and former wife while facing his son's sentencing for their murders, resonated throughout the courtroom. "I have lost my entire family in one horrible night," his statement read. "My beautiful daughter Emma, whose music filled our lives with joy, my former wife Olivia, who despite our differences was a dedicated mother who loved our children completely, and now my son Ethan, whose actions I cannot understand or excuse, but whose fate still breaks what remains of my heart." The statement went on to acknowledge his own failings as a father and expressed his support for whatever sentence the court deemed appropriate, recognizing that no punishment can equal the loss we have all suffered. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Ethan Wilson rose from his seat at the defense table, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded a single sheet of paper. In the 3 weeks since the verdict, he had lost weight and appeared noticeably more subdued than during the trial, perhaps finally grasping the gravity of his situation as the reality of spending potentially the rest of his life in prison began to sink in. "I know that nothing I can say will bring back my mother and sister or make anyone in this room hate me less," he began, his voice barely audible until Judge Reynolds instructed him to speak up. "I didn't understand what I was doing or what it would mean. I thought I was solving a problem, but I was wrong." This limited acknowledgement of wrongdoing, falling short of a full apology or expression of remorse, caused murmurs throughout the courtroom that were quickly silenced by the judge. Defense attorney Michael Novak then presented his sentencing arguments, emphasizing Ethan's age and the scientific evidence regarding adolescent brain development. He argued passionately for a sentence that would include the possibility of parole after 25 years, citing cases where juvenile offenders had been successfully rehabilitated and became productive members of society after release. "The person Ethan Wilson is at 16 is not the person he will be at 40, Novak argued. "While we do not minimize the gravity of his crimes, we ask the court to recognize that the capacity for change and growth is never greater than in youth, and to leave open the possibility of redemption through a sentence that includes the chance, however distant, of eventual release." District Attorney Abigail Thomas countered with a forceful argument for 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available under North Dakota law. She reminded the court of the calculated nature of the crimes, the extensive evidence of premeditation, and the particularly vulnerable nature of the victims. A sleeping mother and a terrified 13-year-old girl killed in their own home by someone they should have been able to trust completely. This was not an impulsive act or a momentary lapse in judgment, Thomas argued, her voice firm but measured. This was a meticulously planned double murder carried out with a level of calculation that would be disturbing in a defendant of any age, but which is particularly alarming in someone so young. She concluded by stating that the community's safety could only be assured by ensuring that Ethan Wilson would never have the opportunity to harm anyone else. After hearing all arguments, Judge Howard Reynolds took a brief recess to finalize his decision, returning to the bench 45 minutes later with a written statement that he would read before pronouncing sentence. The courtroom fell completely silent as the judge, known for his thoughtful deliberations and clear articulation of his reasoning, began to speak. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have presided over many difficult cases, but few have presented the unique challenges of this one," he began. "The defendant before me today was 16 years old when he committed these crimes, old enough to understand the permanence of death and the wrongfulness of murder, but young enough that the law recognizes his brain was still developing in areas related to impulse control and long-term decision-making. Judge Reynolds continued, addressing the specific circumstances of the case that had influenced his decision. However, the evidence presented at trial demonstrated conclusively that these murders were not the result of impulse or sudden passion, but rather of extended planning and deliberation over weeks or even months. The defendant researched methods, prepared tools, selected the optimal time, and took extensive steps to cover his tracks afterward, all indicating a level of premeditation that goes well beyond what might be attributed to youthful impulsivity. The judge then addressed Ethan directly, looking at him over his reading glasses as he stated, "Most troubling to this court is the complete absence of genuine remorse or empathy for your victims, not just in the immediate aftermath of the crimes, but throughout these proceedings, suggesting a profound disturbance in your ability to form normal human connections, even to those who should have been closest to you." The sentence, when it came, was delivered in measured tones that belied its severity. Ethan Wilson, having been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 2 counts of murder in the first degree, this court sentences you to 3 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. 1 for the murder of Olivia Wilson, 1 for the murder of Emma Wilson, and 1 for the heinous nature of your crimes and the breach of trust they represent. The judge acknowledged that this sentence was the maximum allowed by law, but stated that anything less would fail to reflect the calculated nature of these murders, the extreme vulnerability of the victims, and the ongoing danger I believe you would present to society if ever released. As the sentence was pronounced, Ethan visibly slumped in his chair, the full weight of spending the rest of his life in prison finally seeming to register. In explaining this maximum sentence for a juvenile offender, Judge Reynolds addressed concerns about its severity by noting several factors unique to the case. While recent Supreme Court decisions have limited the application of life without parole sentences to juvenile offenders, those limitations primarily apply to cases involving felony murder or accomplice liability, situations where the juvenile did not directly intend to kill. In this case, the evidence of direct intent and extensive premeditation places it within the narrow category of juvenile cases where such a sentence remains constitutionally permissible. He concluded by expressing hope that Ethan would use his time in prison to develop the empathy and understanding that was so tragically absent in your actions, and to find ways to contribute positively even within the confines of incarceration. As Ethan was led from the courtroom for the final time, the impact of the case on the Fargo community was already extending far beyond the judicial outcome. Within days of the sentencing, the school board announced the creation of the Olivia Wilson Memorial Fund for Mental Health Services in Schools, a program designed to increase access to counseling and psychological support for students showing signs of emotional distress or family conflict. The initiative, funded initially through donations from local businesses and community members, aimed to train teachers in recognizing warning signs of potential violence and to provide immediate intervention for at-risk students, a direct response to the recognition that Ethan's deteriorating mental state had shown warning signs that went unaddressed until it was too late. Emma's legacy was honored through the establishment of the Emma Wilson Foundation for Young Musicians, which provided instruments, lessons, and performance opportunities for talented students from low-income families. Her cello teacher, Mr. Gregory Wilson, served as the foundation's first director, channeling his grief into creating opportunities for other young musicians to develop the talents that Emma had never had the chance to fully realize. The foundation's first benefit concert, held 6 months after the trial, featured performances by Emma's former orchestra colleagues playing pieces she had loved alongside professional musicians who donated their time to support the cause. The event concluded with a recording of Emma's final recital performance, her clear, soulful playing filling the auditorium as photographs of her life were projected on a screen, a poignant reminder of the artistry and potential that had been lost. The case also prompted significant changes in the North Dakota juvenile justice and mental health systems. State legislators, moved by testimony about the warning signs that had preceded the murders, introduced bills to strengthen mandatory reporting requirements for school counselors and to increase funding for mental health services in rural communities where access was often limited. The State Department of Education developed new protocols for situations where students expressed concerning thoughts or exhibited behavioral changes, creating clear pathways for intervention before crisis points were reached. These systemic changes, while coming too late for the Wilson family, represented a commitment to preventing similar tragedies in the future by addressing the underlying issues of mental health support, family dysfunction, and early intervention in cases of adolescent distress. For the jurors who had delivered the guilty verdict, the experience of serving on such a high-profile and emotionally devastating case left lasting impacts that continued long after the trial concluded. Several spoke anonymously to the local newspaper 6 months after the sentencing, describing how the evidence they had been required to examine had given them nightmares and changed their perspectives on their own families and communities. One juror described checking on her teenage children while they slept for months after the trial, haunted by the images of Olivia and Emma's final moments. Another spoke of becoming involved in youth mentoring programs, motivated by the belief that positive adult influences might have made a difference in Ethan's life path. All expressed the profound weight of sending a 16-year-old to prison for life, while maintaining their conviction that the evidence had left them no other just option. Samuel Wilson left Fargo immediately after the sentencing, selling the family home and relocating to Arizona, where he had no connections or memories associated with his lost family. Friends reported that he had entered intensive therapy to address both his alcoholism and his grief, recognizing the complex role he had played in the family dynamics that had preceded the tragedy. In a single interview granted to a national magazine a year after the sentencing, Samuel reflected on the warnings he had missed and the ways his own behavior might have contributed to Ethan's distorted thinking. "I failed all three of them," he stated simply. "I failed Olivia by not being the partner she deserved. I failed Emma by not being present enough in her life. And I failed Ethan by feeding his resentment instead of helping him adjust to our new reality after the divorce. That's something I'll live with every day for the rest of my life." Ethan Wilson was transferred to the North Dakota State Penitentiary's juvenile unit, where he would remain until his 21st birthday before being moved to the adult population to serve the remainder of his 3 consecutive life sentences. Prison officials reported that he had adjusted to incarceration with the same emotional detachment he had shown throughout the trial, focusing on obtaining his GED and accessing the prison library, rather than participating in therapeutic programs or expressing remorse for his crimes. His defense team filed appeals on several grounds, including the decision to try him as an adult and the constitutionality of life without parole for a juvenile offender. But legal experts predicted limited chances of success given the particular circumstances of the case and the extensive evidence of premeditation. As the 5-year anniversary of the murders approached, Fargo had begun the long process of healing, though the case remained a defining moment in the city's recent history. The Wilson home, which had stood empty for months after the crimes, was eventually purchased by a local church and converted into a community center offering after-school programs, counseling services, and music lessons, transforming a place of tragedy into one of support and growth. Annual memorial services for Olivia and Emma continued to draw hundreds of community members, their lives celebrated not just for how they ended, but for the positive impacts they had made during their time in Fargo. Teachers still spoke of Olivia's innovative classroom methods, while the youth orchestra performed a piece commissioned in Emma's memory each spring, ensuring that mother and daughter would be remembered not just as victims, but as valued contributors to their community. The case of Ethan Wilson became a case study in criminology and psychology courses throughout the country, examined for what it revealed about juvenile violence, family dynamics, and the warning signs that precede such devastating acts. Mental health professionals pointed to the case as an example of how multiple small interventions, a teacher reporting concerning behavior, a parent seeking therapy for a troubled teen, a school counselor following up more aggressively on troubling essays or comments, might collectively have prevented tragedy if they had been implemented earlier and more systematically. The story of a teenage boy who murdered his mother and sister in their Fargo home became not just a shocking crime narrative, but a cautionary tale about the importance of addressing mental health issues and family dysfunction before they escalate to violence. In the stark landscape of North Dakota, where the endless prairie meets the edge of the city, and residents pride themselves on their resilience in the face of harsh conditions, the Wilson case remained a wound that had scarred over but never completely healed. It had challenged the community's perception of itself as a place where those kinds of things don't happen, forcing a recognition that no place, however seemingly peaceful or ordinary, is immune to the darkest aspects of human behavior. Yet from this recognition had come positive changes, increased mental health resources, stronger community connections, and a deeper awareness of the need to watch for and address the warning signs of potential violence, particularly among young people experiencing family disruption or emotional distress. In this way, the legacy of Olivia and Emma Wilson extended beyond their tragic deaths, contributing to systemic changes that might prevent other families from experiencing similar losses in the future.